Welcome back to Invest ASEAN 2022. Unlike the morning session that we had earlier, this second part of the day, we would have live sessions from 6 different countries concurrently. We have Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. All of the live telecasts would be recorded and you can rewatch all sessions at a later time on our Zoom events platform. Before we begin, please also note that we will have Q&A after each session. So should you have any, please do post them on Slido. To those of you that are physically here with us today, you may scan the QR code on your table. Without further ado, we will now start with our first session. Malaysia's economic recovery from the pandemic is gaining traction on tailwinds from the reopening, but multiple headwinds are also clouding the outlook, namely inflation, Russia-Ukraine war, US-led global interest rate hikes, and China lockdowns. Moderated by our very own Chief Economist, Suhaimi Ilyas, the following session would be joined by esteemed panelists from Bank Negara Malaysia, Ministry of Finance, and Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, also known as IDEAS, for the discussions on monetary and fiscal policies, as well as the narratives on policy, structural and institutional reforms as the country shifts to the endemic stage from the pandemic phase of the COVID-19. Please welcome them to the stage.
Hai. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to those who just joined us, and thank you very much to those who continue to stay with us since this morning as we move to Malaysia Live segment of Maybank Invest ASEAN 2022 conference. I want to state up front, this session is really about let's talk policy session. Part of the reason is because it's pretty obvious there's been too much politics, so I guess it would be a good to take our mind and some time off on that. And I believe there's a lot to talk about on policy fronts in view of the recent developments, current headlines and sound bites, plus the domestic and global issues that resulted in and requires policy responses and actions over the short, medium, and long term, and not just in terms of monetary and fiscal policies, but also in terms of policy, structural, institutional reforms for Malaysia to remain economically competitive, to basically develop the country in a sustainable, equitable, inclusive manners, and become resilient in terms of being able to withstand future shocks and navigate an increasingly complex world. Now, we have a great lineup today to talk about these issues. We are very privileged to have with us this afternoon 3 very esteemed guest panelists, and allow me to briefly introduce them. Immediately to my left is Datuk Syed Abdul Rashid Abdul Ghafur, Bank Negara Malaysia's Deputy Governor. Next to him is Dr. Juwita Muhammad, the Director of Economic and Business and Acting Research Director at the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, ideas. And at the far end there is Dato' Johan Mahmud Marikan, Ministry of Finance Deputy Secretary General for Policy. Thank you, Dato' Rashid, Dato' Juwita, Dato' Johan, for being with us today. I think time is of essence. I want to maximize this session as much as possible for conversation with our panelists. Very difficult to get them. So I guess I have to start this panel session with Dato' Rashid by virtue of seniority and all that. But I think the reason is blindingly obvious. I think this is in relation to Bank Negara's decision to raise overnight policy rate or OPR last month and signal the start of, and I quote from monetary policy statement, unwinding the degree of monetary accommodation. I guess market, me included, got it wrong in terms of this. I mean, we were looking at second half of this year. So I guess it's natural to ask, Dato', what are the reasons, the rationale, the thought process behind Bank Negara's decision on the OPR? And also, I guess, in addition, since we are in this process of unwinding policy support that has been put in place over the past 2 years, what about the status of Bank Negara's various measures put in place to deal with the COVID-19 effect? I mean, basically, what have ended, what remain in place, what has been revised or reviewed to suit and reflect this post-pandemic recovery process? Dato', silakan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Sohami, for the very kind introduction. My fellow panelists, Dato' Johan, Dr. Juwita, Dato' Karosale, and ladies and gentlemen. In fact, I think I have to thank Dato' Karosale and Johan and the rest for this invitation. And I thought the topic that you have chosen in terms of framing a future and Malaysia at the crossroad, I think is very timely, as we are actually at the crossroad in terms of the challenges ahead that we are facing, also in terms of the opportunities that lies ahead in front of us as well. And I'm so very happy actually, to be frank, to be here today physically, to see real people. I think from the past that we have only seen virtual people for the past almost 2 years. I mean, going back to your question, Sohami, I think easily there's 2 or 3 components to that. You asked in terms of the rationale and the thought process behind the recent decision of the MPC. And perhaps related to this in terms of what we'd be interested to know as well, in terms of what's the future path. And thirdly, in terms of the status of the various measures that we put in place during the pandemic, what will happen to those measures in terms of the policy measures, in terms of the assistance that we have provided. Let me just touch on the first part first in terms of the rationale and thought process behind the decision. The main thinking of the Monetary Policy Committee was really premised on the need to ensure that monetary policy remains commensurate to the health of the economy. What we have seen is that from growth perspective, we saw growth is on a firmer footing. And in terms of inflation, while it's rising, but it's manageable and also well anchored. And there is no sign of second round effect. So that's the observation with regard to growth and also inflation. When we say growth is on a firmer footing, this is based on a number of factors. First, in terms of the strengthening of the domestic demand, the better labor market conditions that we are observing. And third, in terms of the improved investment activity and also prospects. I'm sure you would have seen in terms of the announcement or the release of the first quarter numbers. The second rationale for the decision is also in terms of, we believe that the unprecedented conditions that warranted the significant monetary support during the pandemic has actually abated, which brought us to bring the OPR to the historical low of 1.75%. And we thought, I think the situation is no longer required that kind of monetary support. As such, the MPC judged that this is the right time to begin normalizing the extraordinary monetary support during the height of the pandemic. And it is also important to note that we start from a historically low OPR at 1.75%. So even as we adjust, we'll still be accommodative in terms of monetary policy position. Let me just move on in terms of the aspect with regard to price stability. The current situation on inflation in Malaysia is a bit different from what we saw in other countries that are facing double-digit inflation and inflation coming from high demand pressure. What we've seen in case of Malaysia is that the improvement in demand has not been excessive. And secondly is that it is more of a reflective of a normalization from the past period that we have saw in terms of the subdued demand condition during the pandemic itself. The existing domestic price control that is in place and also the spare capacity that we have in the economy, that also provides us with the ability to be a bit more measured in terms of a monetary policy setting. And having said this, of course, we need to be vigilant in terms of to avoid the need to play catch up and also having to undertake stronger measures in the future. So that's why it's important to start the normalization as soon as we see it is appropriate. Other supporting factors, so I mean that we also look at in terms of the decision of the MPC is that when we do the monetary policy, for example, we look at the movements of the exchange rate and also in terms of the overall financial conditions, we look at this insofar as how it affects the outlook on growth and inflation in Malaysia. And also, as what we have always said, we need to rebuild our buffers. So those are the factors in terms of the considerations for the MPC decisions recently. Let me just touch a little bit in terms of the future path. Adjustments, we have said in our MPS, it will be measured and gradual to ensure that the monetary policy remains accommodative to support sustainable economic growth with price stability. We need to be steady-handed in our policy approach to prevent any threat of over-tightening and also to avoid any policy miscalibration that can be harmful to the economy. The timing, pace, and also extent of rate adjustment would also be guided by our ongoing assessment of the Malaysian economy, and we will closely monitor incoming data and developments that could impact on the outlook of the domestic economy. On the final part of your question in regard to the various measures that we have put in place, we have put in a number of measures from policy flexibility, from regulatory perspective, as well as in terms of the funds that we have put in place, and also in terms of assistance provided, especially with regard to repayment assistance to the household and affected businesses. As the economy recovers, I think it's natural. We recognize that there will be certain segments of the economy that will remain to be affected, and therefore that will still require certain kind of targeted measures to be in place. And in utilizing our policy tools, what have been our guiding principles is that we've always been pragmatic, we've always been flexible, targeted, and more importantly, it has to be in line with our mandate itself. And we'll continue with this approach in deciding on the appropriate measure that needs to be put in place in our policy toolkit. And to this end, what we can assure is that assistance will continue to be there for the affected segments of the economy. Perhaps I'll stop there on this question. Thank you.
Thank you, DG. I think the key message there, whether it's with regards to OPR or other Bank Negara measures, it will be in the spirit of what's stated in monetary policy statement, measured and gradual. Thank you, DG. I'm quite sure there will be more questions coming with regards to Bank Negara policy later on. But I guess from the hot topic of interest rates policy in particular, let's move on to another hot topic, which is fiscal policy. Datuk Johan, I'm going to put you in the spotlight here. Over the weekend, Ministry of Finance released the pre-budget 2023 statement. Reading through the statement, the government is sticking to the 6% budget deficit to GDP target. And this is despite that huge jump in fuel subsidy. If I recall correctly from the pre-budget statement, from the original budget 22 allocation of 4 billion, you're talking about 30 billion ringgit now. A staggering amount, but not surprising either, because obviously a reflection of the current situation with regards to crude oil price, $120 per barrel right now. And I believe budget 2022 was premised on slightly below $70 per barrel assumption. And I also found it interesting that the statement mentioned that the surge in fuel subsidy is offset by additional revenues. And that includes revenue coming from those measures, tax measures in budget 2022, things like Cukai Makmur, special voluntary disclosure program for indirect taxes, and the expansion in sales and service tax scope. Forgive me for being kind of, long on numbers here, but that's what you get when you have economists as a moderator. But I recall, the expected net revenue gain from all those special tax measures put in place in budget 2022 is only like, I think, over 6 billion ringgit. As I said, we have this big increase in fuel subsidy. So I guess the question to you is, what kind of upside to revenues other than those special budget 2022 measures we can expect, number one. And number two, whether there are any other recalibrations to budget 2022 taking place, because obviously there's a lot of sound bites about reviewing fuel subsidy. And I'm wondering also, because of this jump in operating expenditure, are there any impact to development expenditure, for example? And of course, whether or not there's going to be extra dividends from Petronas this year on top of what's budgeted. That's Johan. Over to you.
Thank you, Sohaimi. You're asking me all very easy questions. But again, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Assalamualaikum, and a very good afternoon to everyone. Sohaimi, Datuk DG, Dr. Juwita, and also guests. I think first and foremost, thank you so much for reading our pre-budget statement. We're always never too sure how many people read up these documents that we issue. And I think maybe I should just highlight that I think one of government's priorities for 2022 is still focusing on growth and recovery post-COVID. So as you know, given the contraction of 5.5% in 2020 and also just a growth of 3%, we're still below pre-crisis levels. And so a key priority is this year's recovery. And in this context, I think you've already heard from Datuk DG that even with the increase with interest rate, monetary policy remains accommodative. At 2%, it's still below the pre-crisis 3% that we're accustomed to. And obviously, fiscal policy remains expansionary and pro-growth. And I think part of the big question you're asking is about subsidies. I think in that, I think the government, particularly the leaders, feel that at this stage, at an early stage of recovery, they felt it's important to maintain the levels of subsidy in order not to stifle the momentum of recovery and growth. And therefore, government has chosen to maintain some of its subsidies and even increased some subsidies. As you highlighted in our preparation of a budget, we used an assumption of $67 for petrol, whereas obviously now it's already surged well above 100 billion. As you highlighted, there are obviously some measures in budget 2022 that obviously will add to revenue. Cukai Makmur is one of that. Obviously, for the likes of Datuk Khairul Saleh, thank you for your Cukai Makmur contributions, and especially the other banks who are obviously key contributors. And as you alluded to, I guess got Marina from Petronas, we look forward to extra dividends as well, amongst others. But you'd also have seen from first quarter, there has been also an upside in tax revenues. I think so we're clocking it at high 60s billion in the first quarter compared to only below 50 in the equivalent period last year. And I think that also perhaps lends some support to what Datuk DG mentioned about the first quarter, showing at least a strong growth, in fact stronger than perhaps what we might initially have expected, and that perhaps also provides some upside to revenue. But obviously this is something that we need to monitor very closely, because on one hand, we see a strong recovery momentum. We see also that government needs to support that recovery momentum, but at the same time, there are obviously many downside risks to that recovery, especially given the global scenario with high commodity prices, inflationary pressures, and the ongoing geopolitical tensions. But maybe just to focus a little bit on subsidies, as you know, as you highlighted as well, we have actually in budget 2022, we had originally budgeted bantuan and subsidies, social assistance and subsidies, an allocation of 31.5 billion. You have heard from my minister saying that if current controlled prices and current global prices prevail, that number can easily shoot up to 70 billion. And obviously the biggest component would be fuel related. At the current prices that we maintain on, say, petroleum product subsidies in January 2021, the subsidy covering RON 95 diesel and LPG was only about 200 million. 1 year later, in January 2022, it's already 2 billion. And just in April, it's gone up to 4.7 billion. Certainly, these are levels that are not sustainable. But again, there is this balance on how do you balance and supporting the growth recovery and also the sort of rakyats facing the challenges of cost of living. Hence, for now, we've chosen to maintain. But as you would have heard from Minister and also the Prime Minister, the government is really in the focus of trying to see how do we gradually shift towards a more targeted form of subsidy. I think at one point, Bank Negara even did an estimation that the fuel subsidies, I think half of it benefits the higher income. And we've seen it. But Tan Sri Sheikh Alip, who previously was from Tenaga, we saw it in the first half of the year when the government chose to maintain electricity tariffs at a 2-cent rebate for domestic users instead of passing through the ICPT formula of 3.7 cent surcharge. In maintaining all households at a 2-cent rebate, it cost the government a subsidy of about 715 million. But what was interesting is that when we looked at the breakdown of consumers, we saw that those who consume more than 600 kilowatt per hour, which accounts for about 15% of homes, they are 15% of homes, but they consume more than 40% of that subsidy. And the lower income group, which is the one that consume below 300 kilowatt hours, which accounts for about 54% of households, they only consume 22% of subsidy. So I think the hope, at least from the Ministry of Finance, is that at least going into the second half ICPT, we certainly are recommending that we should be focusing the subsidy on the lower income or the lower consumption, and for the higher income, we should be able to pass through that cost. And I think that is the principle of targeted subsidies. We're currently working with the oil coast to develop a system that, to some extent, we hope to mirror what we already have in the electricity industry, where you have tiered pricing. Obviously, it's a lot easier when you only have 1 meter for electricity. They can buy it at multiple stations. We're currently developing a system that we hope that will enable the poor to continue to buy at least a certain quantity of subsidy at subsidized prices, but those who are obviously of high income would then have to pay more. So I think that's the direction in which we want to go to, based on subsidies. Maybe I should stop there.
Well, I mean, something is brewing second half of this year as far as fuel subsidy is concerned. Yes. And thank you very much for actually giving a fair amount of detail about what's in the work. So I think that's great, actually, to know. I'm going to bring Dr. Juwita into our conversation. Dr. Juwita, we went through yet another crisis. We always hear the saying, crises like risks are also opportunities, in the sense that we should take the opportunity to not let crisis gone to waste, so to speak, by not taking the opportunity to do the right things and do things right, so to speak. Now, for ideas, being a policy think tank and research institute, a policy research institute, I mean, what are the low-hanging fruits, quick wins from this? Do the things right and do the right things and do things right, and that would be a help of the economy, to navigate the still, or I would even say more challenging post-pandemic economic landscape, especially in this environment of elevated geopolitical risk and uncertainty, rising inflation and interest rates, a limited fiscal policy space, market volatilities. I mean, Dr. Juwita, any thoughts on that?
Thank you for that very, very difficult question. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, for reminding us that we should put politics aside. So please, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to take this conversation towards policies, looking at policies that introduces structural reforms, and also policies that are able to make Malaysia economically competitive and as well being, again, attractive for FDIs. So I would like to highlight 3 policies that have been introduced recently in order for me to be able to answer the questions about benefiting from crisis as a means to make changes. So again, the first point is on the export ban of chicken and also the revocation of the APs. So obviously, in the name of the liberalization of the food market sector, the revocation of the APs for selected food products are very much welcome. But again, there is a concern that this recent decision to halt about 4 million chickens per month from this month will have unintended negative impacts in the medium to long term. So again, I do understand, we do understand that the knee-jerk policy that was introduced is to safeguard the supply of the chicken, but please allow me to bring us to look at what are the unintended negative impacts. So again, we believe at Ideas that such policies, when it comes to food security, are very much inward-looking, and this is not just for Malaysia, but for other countries in the region as well. And this can actually lead to the disruptions, not only in the domestic market, but also in the global market. So again, the export ban on chickens will have a certain degree of the potential damage as a whole, particularly to the breeders on the ground. We see that with the bans, the profit margins for these breeders will be significantly lessened. And again, in the medium to long term, we can see that maybe suppliers can also stop their operations at the worst case scenario. And looking at long term, we may see also investments and also expansionary plans for this particular sector may shrink over time, knowing that the government is has its ways to maintain supply in the short term with such measures. So we also look at our GVCs when it comes to the chicken supply. So again, this would lead to trade diversions among importing countries like Singapore, and this will again hurt the local industry in the long term with the loss of a significant market. So again, this knee-jerk ban may come with unintended negative impacts. So again, we at Ideas, we believe that such an export ban that we have seen being introduced in different parts of the region have led to negative impacts. For example, in Vietnam and also in Cambodia, during the pandemic, they have initially wanted to stop the exports of rice to other countries in the region, but this has led to the increase of prices for local domestic users because of the duty imports of the rice product. And we have seen that in Indonesia, when they initially wanted to ban the exports of palm oil, and this has only been able to be implemented for like 2 weeks, but then again, because of pressure from the outside market, then they have taken away these bans. So again, in the short run, we at Ideas, we feel that taking an inward-looking stance in solving food security issue, instead of doing that, we can actually tap into our existing bilateral and also multilateral partners for further cooperation to ensure that food security is again attained, not just in good times and also in uncertain times. So here we can leverage on our ASEAN +1 partners, we can leverage on RCEP, and also potentially being a member of CPTPP as well. So food security is not supposed to just be an inward-looking policy. It can be a regional cooperation And this is where, again, the FTAs can gain a new name where everybody benefits, even those at the grassroots level. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Juwita. So obviously, I think the message there is when it comes to, in particular, policy formulation and implementation, I think we need to really go through or be very thorough with the details, you know, in terms of cost and benefits, in terms of intended results against unintended consequences. You need to weigh all this carefully. I want to go back to Dr. Rashid. I think in a manner that is not different from ideas, I would say reading Bank Negara's annual reports over the years, and there has been some interesting stuff in the box articles. I would say my interpretation of those box articles is that Bank Negara has also been very active in what I call policy advocacies and recommendations, as well as calls for actions on, I would say, long-standing as well as long-term issues. I mean, these include affordable housing, quality investment, labor market, and of course, nowadays, the buzzword is climate change, sustainability. In this regard, from Bank Negara perspective, what are the key areas of priorities and urgencies? And how and where Bank Negara sees and plays its role in addressing all these structural issues, facilitating reforms and restructuring, including policy initiatives. DG?
Thank you, Sohami, for that question. Interesting question, and good to know that somebody is reading our box articles. I think, yeah, in terms of moving forward and in navigating this very challenging environment, I think what's important is that we need to persevere on structural reform. And I think what we have been sharing in the past in the box articles at Bank Negara, so basically there are many structural reform areas that is important for the economy. What's the most important one I would say is in terms of really creation of high quality and high paying jobs for Malaysians, and which will really increase the resilience and of our workers and also the household itself. While measures to limit in terms of the extent of scarring, for example, I think is important, but I thought the recovery, so I mean, provide us a very good opportunity for us to really focus on a few key areas of structural reforms that we need to prioritize. What are those? Perhaps maybe 5 areas. Number one is in terms of really transform into a high value added and high income economy by attracting high quality investments. And this can be guided by the framework that the government has launched recently, the new investment aspirations. Second is in terms of the need to pivot towards a more productive processes and areas to build resilience over the longer term. And this can be done by leveraging on technology, digitalization, as well as automation. And that's the second area. The third area will be in terms of develop a future-ready workforce with an accelerated adoption of automation and digitalization as well. This will involve all the upskilling and reskilling of our workforce itself. The other 2 areas that's important is also in terms of social protection and also in terms of ESG. We need to accelerate the social protection reforms, and this will go a long way to help address the existing vulnerabilities and also will ensure a longer term resilience of our society itself. And final point in terms of the ESG, I think this is critical to adopt the ESG now, particularly to ensure that Malaysia remains globally competitive while building a more sustainable and resilient future. And of course, there are many other reforms that we need to put in place as well in terms of the future workforce, in terms of reducing reliance on foreign labor, and there are many other areas that we can talk about. And I think what we have done so far is that we've been focusing quite a lot on short-term measures. I think one short-term measures, I think like the full subsidy, for example, I think have helped to address in terms of some of the issues facing the economy. But what we need is more in terms of to move away from reliance on these short-term policies, which could have longer-term repercussions. And I'm glad to hear the thinking from the Ministry of Finance with regard to the moving forward regard to the fuel subsidy itself. From Bangladesh perspective, I think if you could have read our blueprint, our developmental priorities for the financial sector are also aligned with the reform strategies and areas that I have touched earlier on. We mentioned in the blueprint finance for all, finance for transformation, and finance for sustainability. So these are the focus areas that we have actually outlined in the blueprint. And our immediate focus now is really to quickly implement the short-term, near-term priorities and to start in terms of initiate the longer-term priorities as well. And our aim is really to ensure that the financial sector continue to serve the needs of the economy. And there are 5 strategic thrusts that we have identified in the blueprint itself. I think I'm sure you have read about this in terms of funding Malaysia's economic transformation. So that's how we'll support in terms of our transformation process. Second, uplifting the financial well-being of household and businesses. Third, in terms of advancing digitalization. And all these things that we have done is that it will really complement our efforts to preserve the financial stability and promote the fair treatment of consumers. Another area is in terms of really positioning the financial system to facilitate a robust green economy. So that's very critical as well. And another point that we need to also be very is that we need to ensure that we're able to execute this in a very well and coordinated manner. That's very critical. I think maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, DG. I'm going to go back to Dato' Johan. Another easy question for you. Again, it's a takeaway from the pre-budget 23 statement. Obviously, the government is sending the message across that it is continue to guide for fiscal consolidation. So we are talking about bringing down budget deficit to GDP ratio to 3.5% by 2025. And I think we know when we look at 12 Malaysia plan, for example, there is no cutback in government spending. It will continue to increase. And one of the items that stands out is this 400 billion allocation for development spending in 12 Malaysia plan, as opposed to 250 billion spending under 11 Malaysia plan. So another sort of big item, line item showing a big increase. And now we have talk of GST comeback and so on. So is it fair to assume a revenue-centric, revenue-driven consolidation of budget deficit over the next few years? And MOF also talk about key fiscal reforms measures or steps like introducing a Fiscal Responsibility Act and medium-term revenue strategy. Can Datuk share with us what to expect from basically the Fiscal Responsibility Act and medium-term revenue strategy?
Hi, yeah, that's question so easy. I should pass it on to someone else. So thank you for that. I think maybe first, I think it's very dangerous when you suddenly say that going forward, the budget will be revenue-centric. So I think the first and foremost, I think it's very important. I joked a little bit about Datuk Khairul paying the Cukai Makmur, but just to reinforce the point, the Cukai Makmur is just a one-off. It's not going to happen again. But having said that, we are committed towards a gradual fiscal consolidation, but I think it has to cover both. The reason why I spoke earlier at length about subsidy rationalization is that it's not just about strengthening revenues, but it's also about improving the efficiency of at least our expenditure. And even when you talk about revenue, I think there's a lot to be said about not necessarily new taxes, but also in terms of improving our existing tax measures, where increasingly we see that there is obviously some potential leakage. I mean, part of the tax review panel that was formed in the Ministry of Finance spoke about how do we be more targeted, for example, in terms of our incentives. Dr. DG spoke a little bit about the government is formulating a new national investment aspirations, and part of it was trying to articulate what are then the new sectors that we should be looking at. Some of that obviously are the usual suspects. We'll be focusing on, for example, the E&E sector, for example, chemicals, digital economy. So obviously got Leonard from pharmaceuticals. These are some of the focus areas that we're looking at. And so if we are driving those and again, wanting to value those new investments, and I think Dr. DG made a very important point about how do we promote quality investments, which actually, and I think the key is providing higher paying jobs. And I think that's where I think part of the shift beyond just the consolidation of the incentives to really what we should be promoting, but not just in terms of promoted sectors, but ensuring that it's higher value added activities and perhaps moving away from incentives that, we have typically the investment tax allowance that always values capital expenditure, whereas some of the higher value added investments or activities that we want to promote aren't necessarily capex heavy. So I think that's maybe part of the shift that we need to do towards enhancing at least our tax structures. So it's not all about potentially new taxes. But as you mentioned, we plan to introduce the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Minister has said that this is something targeted by the end of this year. I think what that plans to do is to put into law at least some of our financial targets, and part of it will involve having a fiscal charter which will be tabled to Parliament, which then sets out what are the key metrics that we target for, for example, maybe an overall debt envelope. As you know, even now, a statutory debt limit doesn't capture all levels of debt. Basically, also limits also around, for example, government guarantees, which is also probably another area that part of the fiscal reform needs to address. But that's something that we plan to do by the end of the year, and so more details should be coming out in time for our budget 2023. But maybe just also to step back a little bit, and also maybe just I also wanted just to follow up from what Dr. DG mentioned. As you have seen in terms of our pre-budget statement, I think part of it as well is that whilst this year for 2022 the focus is on really the recovery, as we look ahead, and my minister has spoken about the 3 Rs, recovery, resilience, and reform. I think increasingly budget 2023, as we look ahead, how can we then increasingly effect that transition more from the shorter term recovery measures towards looking at what can we do to strengthen our resilience and reform in important areas. And I think some of that was already mentioned by Dr. DG, for example, in the area of income. When we talked about recovery, I think the minister also, I think you don't want just basically a GDP recovery, but also a recovery in terms of employment and income for Malaysians and businesses, and towards that, you see, for example, in budget 2022, the focus on Jamin Kerja, which is our initiative to create 600,000 new jobs with an allocation of 4.8 billion. One thing we saw during the COVID crisis was the vulnerability of those when they get displaced in jobs. The need for perhaps, for example, one area of social protection is the need to strengthen active labor market interventions, particularly job placements, especially when you saw a key sector like tourism being completely affected. How do we then have the institutional response to potentially reskill and redeploy them to where jobs are growing? And as you said, there are opportunities in this crisis. We see, for example, a lot more opportunities in digitalization. How can we redeploy some of that human capital to be ready for the future? The other one that, particularly in terms of social reform that we saw, social protection reform that we saw is important going forward, is such as we saw that during the crisis, the informal sector perhaps was less well protected by the likes of SOCSO and EPF. We see that, for example, many more are doing gig work, like I guess all of us here use food delivery. And many of those are not formally employed. They're almost like contractors by Grab or Food Panda. Therefore, they don't even have SOCSO protection. So I think that's an area where how to ensure that the social protection system covers those who are less, the informally employed and the lower income, to ensure that in the event of future shocks, and Dr. DG spoke also about building buffers, how to ensure that in any event, any future shocks, we are better able to protect some of these groups, and that's a key area of reform. I think one area perhaps that wanted to touch on, you mentioned about the larger 12 Malaysia plan of 400 billion. I guess a key part is that beyond looking at promoting high income, we also need to look at inclusiveness. I think that's why a key part, whether it's a follow-on from Makmuran Bersama, is that trying to see how do we reduce the imbalance, not just say between communities, but also between regions. And so that's a key pillar of the 12 Malaysia plan. how do we then refocus up to about 50% of the development expenditure towards the 6 states of lower income 6 states to try to rebalance at least development outcomes throughout the country. I think the other one which Dr. DG mentions, I think on ESG, I think that's something that we increasingly need to do. And it's good of a forum like this because I think increasingly we've seen it's not just about environment, although environment's a key part, and we've seen how, for example, our plantation companies have been affected when obviously foreign markets are not convinced by their compliance to some of, like, for example, our sustainable palm oil standards, or even on labor or some of our rubber producers. I think increasingly that's an area that government working together with SC and Bursa, we do need to strengthen. I think ESG compliance and disclosure by our companies, and I think Bursa, as you know, has already done their public consultation on that and hope to then firm up and announce more details on the sustainability framework going forward to at least strengthen that aspect of corporate relations.
Thank you, Dr. Johan, for that very comprehensive response to my query, and also reassuring us that Cukai Makmur is really one-off. So let's put that topic to rest. Dr. Juwita, we have heard from Dr. Rashid, we have heard from Dr. Johan on more of this medium to longer term policy issues and priorities. Ideas also has been at the forefront of research on policy advocacies for all these topics concerning policy, structural, institutional reforms, notably in the area of promoting economic competitiveness, sound and transparent public finance, social policy for inclusive, equitable and sustainable development. I just want to know what are ideas, wish list and calls for actions. I mean, you have on both sides of you 2 policymakers. You might as well take the opportunity to, just pass the message, so to speak.
I'm so glad to be here. The list is quite long, and I can email you both separately after our discussion here. No, I've put in different buckets. So my colleagues at Ideas also took this opportunity to highlight what is on our wish list. So again, on sound and transparent public finance, we ask for a political financing act to be tabled to reduce political corruption, money politics, and for a more transparent and accountable political system. We also ask for Malaysian institutions like MACC and others to function independently and free from partisan or political interests. We also ask that appointments to public bodies and institutions to be made with transparency and accountability. So on equitable and sustainable development, Ideas believes that investing in health and also education sectors for all is a fundamental determinant of economic growth, as human capital development increases labor's skills and also productivity and also quality of life. So we've done a lot of work on Orang Asli and refugee children and also different vulnerable communities. And we looked at different impacts it had during the COVID-19, and we urgently would like to advocate for Orang Asli children to have better access to quality education through different measures to integrate indigenous culture and also history into mainstream school curriculum, promoting a strength-based discourse in order to shift away from deficit discourse on the Orang Asli communities. And we also are pushing for equipping teachers and also school leaders to deliver quality education for Orang Asli students using different types of creative ways. Overall, there's an urgent need for better monitoring and evaluation of existing Orang Asli education programs to ensure efficient and effective delivery and implementation on the ground. And on promoting economic competitiveness when it comes to attracting foreign trade, foreign direct investments, we held a roundtable on how Malaysia can attract foreign direct investments with the usage of non-tax or non-fiscal incentives. And from our partners on the ground. They mentioned that there needs to be a more effective one-stop centers. There needs to be more clarity in policy introductions. And again, there needs to be just clear communication from the government when it comes to implementation of different types of policies on the ground. So these are our asks. So to know more, I can further elaborate on these topics. Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Swami, just in case you think that we don't talk to the people outside Putrajaya, just to share. I mean, ideas obviously is someone that Ministry of Finance engages with. In fact, the whole issuance of a pre-budget statement, actually that's part of the recommendations that we receive from ideas as part of improving our budget transparency process. And in fact, they were kind enough even to help organize some roundtables around the consultation papers that we issued last year. And so we do look forward, particularly since our public participation score on budget still is relatively low. So I think that's another area that we look forward to collaborating with ideas, particularly this year for budget 2023.
That's great to know, especially in the spirit of this whole of government, whole of nation approach to policy making. I don't want to be accused of hogging the limelight, hogging the session, being the one who asking questions. So we do have some questions coming in from the floors. So through the Slido, let me look at them. Maybe I'll take the first one. Interesting topic also, probably alluding to particular measures that were undertaken during the past couple of years, i.e. the usage of APF savings to provide what you call some offsets to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 pandemic to rakyat. The question is from Gerald Ambrose. Malaysia has emerged from 27 months of lockdown in pretty good shape, except for personal savings. I think, how does the panel suggest we rebuild this? Maybe DG, want to start first on that topic?
Thank you, Swami. I think it's a very relevant question in terms of savings. I think it's definitely a concern to almost all of us. I think so that's where I think it's important for us to start rebuild our buffers, and this includes in terms of savings. So that's one benefit that we also get from the raise in the OPR recently. Basically, for the depositors, what will happen is that will provide greater income from savings, and we hope that will also encourage savings, and that will go a long way towards rebuilding savings as well. I think what's important is we need to also go back to the basic in terms of the level of income. How do we enhance the income of the people so that we get more income and more can go into savings, and we can then rebuild the savings that have been utilized during the pandemic. I think for obvious reason, we need to allow people to use some savings during the pandemic itself. But I think that's where it's important in terms of how do we then rebuild this moving forward. I think we need to focus on measures that can help in terms of enhance the level of income of the people itself. And thirdly, I would say in terms of the social protection system. So that's where I think the pandemic has revealed a number of gaps in the social protection framework. And I'm glad Dr. Johan touched on this as well. There are many areas that we can improvise in terms of the social protection framework itself. Maybe I'll stop there.
Maybe to follow up, again, thanks, Jerry, for asking the tough question. But I think certainly if you ask us in the Ministry of Finance, would we want to normally allow for withdrawals from EPF? Obviously, our answer would obviously be not. Obviously, no. I think we're all quite acutely aware of the insufficiency of retirement savings as part of our general population. But again, this comes back to what Dr. DG is saying, is also a function of the income levels of our people. And that basically was coming back to what happened during the crisis. What we found was that the vulnerability of particularly our lower income households in really not having very much buffers in terms of savings, even tied over a relatively short period of unemployment. So when faced with a situation where, I guess some of them would paraphrase Keynes and saying in the long run we're all dead. The situation is why talk to us about long term, when they were basically having to contend with very immediate financial stress. And so I think then the government obviously took then the difficult decision of allowing for those withdrawals from EPF. The last one obviously being the very last one. And towards having to rebuild savings, I think for that reason, as you're probably aware, starting July, we'll be reverting back to increasing the minimum contribution from 9% to 11% for employees, and beginning August, as part of trying to recoup for those who withdrew, or then the subsequent contribution, EPF will go back to filling up account 1 first, rather than, as you know what I mean, it's going 2030 account 1, account 2. Basically, we'll have to fill up first account 1 to then rebuild at least those savings that have been withdrawn. So I think this certainly is a direction. As we come out of this recovery, we also need to rebuild that resilience, and hopefully as part of a broader direction, strengthen social protection.
Dr. Juwita, any thoughts on your part on this topic? I guess it's partly concerns about adequacy of retirement savings, you know.
Yes, we have seen that Malaysia is going into an aging society within the next 5 to 10 years. So again, for obvious reasons, we were a bit worried and concerned about the EPF withdrawal, especially in the time of endemic. So again, looking at the social safety nets, I think there should be a formalized social safety net to cater to our aging society. And I do feel that there is also a concern here because Malaysia is again a developing country. We're a middle income country, and we're not we haven't graduated from that level yet. And we are on the trajectory of becoming an aging society. And this is a worry for society, for the economy. How is the economy going to be able to grow into that high income status country? And again, when you think about a high income status country, you think about a relatively abundant skilled workers on the ground. And do we have that for now? So we do know that to graduate from a low production country with relatively low skilled workers, we need to be able to shift our manufacturing industries and our sectors to a more digitized and also automized industry sectors. But again, at the same time, we need to allow and empower our workers on the ground through trade associations to work and also workers associations to be able to negotiate and also bargain better wages and non-wages packages. So again, when you look at developed countries, this is very much one of the characteristics. And again, as a trade economist, I'm sorry, I have to say this again, with the CPTPP, with the ratification of CPTPP, you need to be able to allow bargaining between employers and employees. And this is why FTAs like CPTPP can give value to smaller countries like Malaysia, because we not only look at traditional chapters, but we look at non-traditional discipline chapters like labor, like the environment, and also like IPR. So again, if we want to be at that level of a high income status country, I think part of the plan would be to ratify CPTPP, and hopefully this will come in September. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Juwita. So quite clearly, one key aspect here is what I call active labor market policies. Yeah, I think something that even Bank Negara also has touched in its report. I guess there's one inevitable question, and fortunately, it kind of directed to Dr. Johan. Amid all this talk about possible GST comebacks, there's a string of details that people want to know. I mean, you know, I guess I'll start with essentially what's lesson we learned from previous GST implementation. I mean, in terms of what can we expect in terms of rates, in terms of timing of its reintroduction, will there still be zero-rated exempted lists and so on? But I guess right at the beginning, what are the key lessons we learned from previous GST implementation?
Thanks for that question. I think just for clarity, I better make sure that I start off by saying that, no decision has been made on the reintroduction of GST. And as my minister has clearly said, no new taxes, is being envisioned until, our recovery is really firmly on track. But having said that, as you know, we are obviously looking to consolidate our fiscal position, and certainly GST is something that we would be looking at. if you talk about, I think, lessons from the previous, I think one key standout lesson that we took away was in terms of the efficiency of refunds. I think if refunds are slow, then there's a tendency that the producers then will then price in the lack of refunds, and therefore then price increases tend to be higher than what our economic models would have suggested with the introduction of GST. So I think that's certainly one area which would need to be enhanced. But in terms from a tax efficiency point of view, I'm not sure whether it is unanimously agreed on, but when you look at other jurisdictions, typically the authority that collects indirect taxes tend to be one, let's say UK. And I think that also strengthens, for example, the tax authorities' ability to effectively, reduce leakage by having the access to both data on sales and also profits. Maybe that is something that we should be looking at. If you're asking me about things like rates, well, that's I think given the negativity, I mean, even though almost everyone in the world has some form of GST, but unfortunately in Malaysia, how it's been played out to be such a negative thing, I think I would imagine that it would be difficult for us to want to reintroduce it at a high rate, for example. I think that would be difficult to do from practical terms, but we would probably still need to maintain, I think, zero-rated goods. I think for a simple reason that the economists would say that GST to some extent is regressive because the poor pays it, or as opposed to now the personal income tax, which tends to be focused more on the rich. So I think therefore to rebalance some of that regressiveness, you'd still want to have zero-rated items, particularly for basic food items and the like, particularly those which are required for lower income households. Perhaps I should stop there.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to let you off so easy. In addressing the regressiveness of GST, potential regressiveness of GST, would it not also be perhaps in consideration of MOF to look into in enhancing the redistributive role of a tax system? For example, what about ideas or talks about capital gains tax, for example? Any thoughts on that?
I don't know if you got any policy mandate to talk about capital gains tax, but I think one of the dilemmas is that on one hand, we look in developed nations and clearly, capital gains tax it's a very normal thing. But when you talk about capital gains tax in the Malaysian context, and we at MOF have had numerous engagements, corporate sector and even the tax professionals, they're all very nervous about any suggestions of capital gain tax in Malaysia because they always say, look, we're in Asia, we're a very mercantile type of culture. It's the entrepreneurs that need to be motivated to invest risk capital, which create jobs, and that's a very strong narrative, I think, in this part of the world. And there's always the thing that, if you introduce capital gains tax, it will lead to a flight of capital. So I think that's one thing to note. And even as you notice when the government, in terms of even RPGT, when we then imposed, taking away the minimum number of years and having a minimum, you notice that there's also a strong pushback, even when you talk about property, what more for other forms of capital gains. Having said that, from a theoretical point of view, if, putting aside the capital gains tax for individuals, if you look at corporate, there is a bit of disconnect that, let's say, normal sales of items you make would then be charged full corporate tax rate. But let's say if a company chooses to sell its office building, then if it's deemed capital gains, it doesn't get any tax. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect. So from a theoretical point of view, it would make sense to try to not have such a discontinuity, either it's zero or full corporate tax. So it is something that we should look at, but it is not something that, based on our engagements, is very well received. So I think that's something that I think we really have to carefully study. Certainly, there's no plans to do it for listed shares. I think certainly, I mean that's probably the last one that you do. But perhaps the first thing we need to look at is perhaps the distinction between revenue and capital items in looking at the computation of corporate income tax, perhaps. Maybe that could be a start.
Thanks, Dr. Johan. Never easy to talk about tax. I mean, not a popular topic. There's never a right time to increase tax rates or introduce new tax. Anyway, I want to ask. I mean, there are few sort of questions pertaining to OPR, DG, as promised. I mean, from Bank Negara's monetary policy statement, as I said earlier, there is that reference about measured and gradual. Specifically, what does measured and gradual implies for OPR path going forward? Sorry to ask that question, but that's the kind of question you're going to get when you are in conversation with economists, fund managers, analysts on that topic. And following that, people also, I think, are curious to know what would be the neutral or terminal OPR rate. I mean, are we going to see, back to pre-COVID-19 level of 3% or higher? And I think people are also wondering, besides those factors you mentioned at the beginning, influencing or leading to the decision by BNM last month, there is still concern about downside risk to economic outlook, and there's also people are wondering whether the motivation for OPR move also is because of what's happening to factors like not just domestic price, but let's say the external price of our money, exchange rate. What about the fact that other central banks are really kind of putting metal to the pedal in terms of raising interest rate in view of the inflation situation? Dato' DG.
Thank you for the question. Expected in terms of this OPR question in regard to the measured and gradual. In fact, we received a number of questions when we had the sessions with the analysts on this as well. What do we mean by measured and gradual? So basically, it's really in terms of the timeline, in terms of timing, and so in terms of the level, the extent of the adjustment itself. I think what's important is that we will not need to be aggressive in this manner. So that's why we say it's gradual and also measured. We're not in the same situation as what we are seeing in the advanced economy in terms of the inflation and in terms of the strength of demand that we are experiencing over there. So we're not in that position. And as I mentioned just now, monetary policy would remain accommodative. So that's something that we have mentioned. And even adjusting by 25 basis points earlier, it still remains accommodative, given that we are starting from a very low base. And the extent and pace of the adjustment will definitely depend in terms of how strong the economy would grow, and also in terms of the impact on the inflation itself. And what we are doing is really to appropriately calibrate our monetary policy accommodation based on realities on the ground itself. On the outlook for both growth and also inflation. You touched about the terminal rate. I think we are not, and we should not be fixated, I think, on a particular number. And I think what is really important is that we need to calibrate the level of monetary policy, monetary accommodation that is commensurate to the outlook of the growth and inflation. And that will support sustainable growth moving forward. So that's very critical. So that's the position in terms of the gradual and also measured in terms of our view regard to the terminal rate.
Thanks, DG. So minimally, I guess, no 50 basis point rate hike kind of thing. Don't worry about that. And I guess really the question is whether we're going to see successive rate hikes or whether it's a case of from now on, MPC meetings would be, in quotes, live. Data dependent and all that. Okay, great. We are going through this question in Slidos. There's something that perhaps worth asking the panelists here. Question from Angela Chin. Rising interest rate, global supply chain issues, cause for rising inflation rates and weaker ringgit. But I think a real question is really where is Malaysia positioning itself in ASEAN, or perhaps if I can rephrase it also, how should we leverage on our position within ASEAN, especially in this current context where, we have the sort of a struggle among the superpowers that has led to some shift in terms of trade and investment. And I noticed, and we do also notice when we look at data, what is very interesting is FDI flows across ASEAN countries are actually doing well, doing great. There seems to be something going on there. I suppose it's partly in relation to the particular aspect the person asking question just now highlighted, the supply chain issue. So I guess it is in relation to supply chain resilience, supply chain security, and so on. So I'm going to throw this to the panel. I mean, what are your respective thoughts with regard to how should we position ourselves within ASEAN and in relation to what's happening with regards to the global situation right now? Maybe we can start with Dr. Juwita first.
Thank you for that question on GVCs. I think we, as a member of ASEAN, we have a very good position here. So again, going back to trade and goods and services, we have just ratified the RCEP earlier this year, and we are now, we are already entered into force. And I think we can leverage on this cooperation, not just in chapters of trade in goods and trade in services, but we can also latch upon the provisions on the e-commerce, for example. So again, when we look back pre-pandemic, way before the pre-pandemic, just looking at the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, we saw that even with a reduction, drastic reduction of tariff rates for most of the products within the ASEAN member states, we saw that the trade share among ASEAN countries did not go beyond 25%. So trade outside of ASEAN were much higher than that. And economists believe that it is also because of the non-tariff measures that are introduced almost in parallel to the reduction of the tariff rates. So again, it comes back to how do we manage non-tariff measures? How do we introduce and also eliminate non-tariff measures in a very timely way? We have also done a short study on GVCs for PPEs during the pandemic. We saw that at that time, RCEP member countries, at that time, not RCEP just yet, including India, we saw that for PPEs, countries were erecting non-tariff measures in terms of export bans. And again, this was very timely because of the short supply of the PPEs. But then again, when we fast forward it to the endemic era now, we found that even with a high production capacity for PPEs and with increased demand worldwide and also domestically, and also with production capacity being able to meet local and also international demands, these non-tariff measures are still in place. So this is why I feel that non-tariff measures are so addictive. Protectionism is very addictive. But then again, we can leverage on our position in ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. We can leverage on our newly ratified RCEP agreement, and then coming up to the CPTPP ratification. There's something also very new on the horizon, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It's not an FTA, but it is going to be. So again, we are at the center of it. So Malaysia, we should definitely leverage on these international cooperation.
Any thoughts from Dr. Rashid?
Thank you. I think to add to what Dr. Juwita has mentioned, perhaps maybe on 3 areas. Number one is in terms of ASEAN has always been an important trade partner and also for investment purposes as well. So I thought there's many opportunities for us to further enhance in terms of the level of integration within ASEAN itself. I think one area that certainly can do more is in terms of the financial sector integration itself. I think much has been done over the last 10 to 20 years, but I think definitely we can focus more on that as well. And secondly, in terms of there's a lot of areas for collaboration. One good example is in terms of climate change. That's why we're working very closely with our ASEAN partners in terms of coming up with a taxonomy, and so in terms of sharing of information, and so in terms of really voicing out the risk of the transitional risks that might come from the climate change policies as well. How does this will affect in terms of the emerging market economies in particular? So that's why I think collaboration in that regard would also be very important, and also in terms of database for sharing information. And thirdly, in terms of digitalization, I think with the pandemic, focus has been more towards digitalization and also payment. So that's where I think another area where we can really enhance in terms of the linkages between the ASEAN countries that can also facilitate payment mechanism. Thank you.
Johan?
Hi, thanks. I think there's always been this big promise of ASEAN as a single market, and perhaps we can't really fully leverage on that until we address some of the issues which Dr. Juwita mentioned. And it's not just also about greater integration in terms of movement of goods, but also in terms of movement of human capital as well, to really fully realize those potential benefits. And I think obviously we've always prided ourselves to be an open trading nation with imports and exports being more than 100% of GDP. So certainly that's something that by really reducing barriers, certainly that it's key as part of Malaysia's future. And certainly in some sectors, as we know, for example, for E&E, which continues to be our core sector, the supply chains are always fairly distributed. So it always helps to have less barriers between countries to strengthen that. Certainly some of our ASEAN neighbors are key as part of, for example, palm oil, get the collaboration with Indonesia, even on rubber with Thailand. These are things that certainly there's a lot more we can do on those fronts. But I think and also the other things that ASEAN is well positioned as this alternative to China. So even the recent announcement by Biden to remove the import duties for solar panels from Southeast Asian countries, that's something that we should continue to leverage on as part of future, but certainly not at the expense of forsaking our close ties and relationships with both India and China. And one other area perhaps which is topical with supply chain disruptions, particularly on food, we should increasingly be seeing how do we strengthen food security through bilateral arrangements, which I think Juwita touched on as well. We don't necessarily have to get sure it's 100% self-sufficiency on rice by actually growing the rice here. We should also be seeing how we can build bilateral linkages for long-term contracts of supply to strengthen food security.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, the official timekeeper says time's up. To be honest, I'm starting enjoying myself doing this after such a long time not being on stage. But certainly as a moderator, it's fun because you're the one lobbing questions rather than taking question and answer it. So thank you very much, DG, Dr. Juwita, Dr. Johan. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today. So ladies and gentlemen, please show our appreciation to our panelists.
Thank you to our line of panels. We will now take a short break and be back at 3:30 for our next session. So see you then. To Suhaimi.